Have you ever wondered how a mother feeds 5 hungry kids when the refrigerator is almost completely empty and there are only a few potatoes, a small onion, and one cheap piece of meat left in the house? Have you ever asked yourself why I used to sneak oats into my meatballs, or why I kept a jar of leftover pickle juice on the counter like it was liquid gold? I'm 70 years old. I raised 5 healthy, strong children on a budget so small, most people today would laugh if I told them the number. And today, for the very first time, I'm opening the grease-stained notebook my mother left me, a little crumbling book from 1952, and I'm going to show you exactly how we survived and why these tricks are more powerful now than they've ever been. I'll be honest with you. When I walk through a grocery store today and I see young mothers standing in the cereal aisle, staring at their phones, ordering dinner through an app, while perfectly good chicken thighs sit right there on the shelf for a few dollars, something tightens in my chest. Not anger exactly, more like a deep, aching sadness, because those mothers don't know. They don't know what it looks like when a pantry is truly empty. Not, we're out of the good snacks empty. I mean the kind of empty where you open every cabinet 3 times, hoping something will appear that wasn't there before. I know that empty. I've lived inside it. It was the winter of 1981. My husband had been laid off from the steel plant just before Christmas, and we had 5 children between the ages of 3 and 11 sitting at our kitchen table every single day, looking at me with those wide, trusting eyes that said, "Mom knows what to do. Mom will figure it out." And I had to figure it out. There was no choice. There was no credit card to tap, no app to open, no one to call. There was only the kitchen, the old cast-iron pot that had belonged to my mother-in-law, a giant, dented, beautiful thing, heavy as a small boulder and black from 30 years of daily use. And there was Grandma Benedita's notebook. That notebook. Lord, let me tell you about that notebook. It was given to me by my mother on the day I got married, wrapped in a piece of brown paper tied with kitchen string. She held my face in both her hands and said, "Whenever you feel lost in that kitchen, open this." Benedita never wasted a single thing, and she fed a family of 9 on a factory worker's salary. Read her words. Do what she says. I put it on the shelf above the stove, and for the first years of my marriage I barely touched it, because we were doing fine. But that winter of 1981, I pulled it down and I read every single page. The first thing Grandma Benedita taught me, and the first thing I want to tell you about, is that water is an ingredient. This sounds almost stupid when I say it out loud, but most people today don't cook with this understanding. When I boiled pasta for 5 children, I never, ever poured that cloudy, starchy pasta water down the drain. Never. I kept a big coffee mug beside the stove, and I ladled that liquid into it before I drained the pot. That pasta water, thick with dissolved starch, would go directly into whatever sauce I was stretching that night. A thin tomato sauce with a cup of pasta water and a knob of old butter becomes something that clings to every noodle, something rich and coating and satisfying. It turns a nothing sauce into a real dinner. My children never knew the difference. They just scraped their plates clean and asked for more. The second thing the notebook taught me was about fat, specifically about saving fat. Every time I roasted a chicken, which wasn't often because a whole chicken was a luxury, I had a wide-mouthed mason jar sitting on the counter beside the roasting pan. Every drop of fat and juices that pooled in that pan went straight into the jar, cooled, and went into the refrigerator. That chicken fat became the flavor base for everything else that week. Fried eggs, sautéed vegetables, the beginning of a soup. Benedita called it liquid gold, and she was absolutely right. Today, people buy sprays and oils and specialty fats they can't even pronounce, and all along their chicken was dripping pure flavor right into the trash. It breaks my heart every time I think about it. The third trick, and this one shocked my daughter-in-law the first time she watched me do it, was what I did with my cheaper, tougher cuts of meat. On a budget, you cannot buy tenderloin. You buy what's on sale. You buy the chuck, the shank, the chicken leg quarters, the pork shoulder. And those cuts, God love them, can be tough as leather if you don't know the secret. The secret is vinegar. A splash of apple cider vinegar or even plain white vinegar added to the braising liquid breaks down the tough connective tissue in those cheap cuts over a few hours of slow cooking. I would put a piece of bottom round into that great black pot with an onion, 2 carrots, some water, a splash of vinegar, and a bay leaf, and I'd let it go for 3 hours on the lowest possible flame. What came out was tender, falling apart, deeply flavored meat that tasted like it cost 10 times what I paid. My kids thought they were eating something special. They were. They just didn't know the special part was my patience and Benedita's notebook. By the fourth trick, I had learned to make meat disappear. Not in the way you're thinking. I made it stretch. When ground beef was what we could afford, and sometimes we could only afford a pound of it for all 7 of us, I would mix it in a large bowl before I ever touched the stove. Into that pound of ground beef I would fold in a full cup of rolled oats. Uncooked, dry oats, mixed right in with the raw meat and the egg and the salt and pepper. The oats would absorb the juices as the meatballs or the meatloaf cooked, swelling up and taking on the flavor of everything around them, and they would become completely invisible, indistinguishable from the meat itself. My children ate oatmeal in their meatballs for years and never once had the slightest idea. 1 pound of meat became enough to fill a deep baking dish. 1 pound fed everyone. That is the kind of alchemy Benedita was teaching me. The 5th trick lives in the bottom of a jar of pickles. I am completely serious. When the last pickle is gone, and in our house pickles disappeared fast because I served them alongside everything to add flavor without cost. That jar of brine sitting at the bottom is not garbage. That liquid is a tenderizer, a flavor builder, a marinade, and a bread enhancer all at once. I used to pour pickle juice over cheap chicken thighs and let them sit overnight. The next day those thighs had been transformed by the acidity and the salt. They were moist. They had absorbed a subtle flavor that was hard to identify, but impossible not to love. I also used a spoonful of pickle brine in my salad dressings in place of vinegar, because the brine already carries herbs and spices and salt. It is a complete ingredient hiding inside what most people throw away. Every time I look at my 5 grown, healthy children today, 3 daughters and 2 sons, all of them strong, all of them well, I feel something I can't quite name settle into my bones. I know their bodies were built in that kitchen. I know their bones were strengthened by the soups I stretched with pasta water, the meat I tenderized with vinegar, the secret oats in every meatball. Grandma Benedita didn't just write down recipes in that crumbling little notebook. She wrote down how to survive with love. She wrote down how to turn an empty pantry into a dinner table surrounded by laughing children. And I want you to have what she gave me. I know how frightening grocery bills feel right now. I know the look on a young mother's face when she's doing the math in the produce aisle. So I did something I've never done before. I gathered all of Benedita's exact recipes, every penny-saving technique, every trick she passed to my mother who passed them to me, and I made them into a little digital book. I left a copy for you in the pinned comment below this video. It's my gift to your family. Go get it. Let it feed your children the way it fed mine. And now, let me tell you what she taught me about turning stale bread into the most comforting dinner you've ever tasted. The sixth trick is what Benedita called the resurrection of bread. In our house, bread went stale. Of course it did. With 5 children eating, we bought the large loaves because it was more economical, and the end of the week always brought hard heels and forgotten slices that had dried out completely. I never threw them away, not once. I would tear the stale bread into rough chunks and cover them with warm water or warm milk, whichever I had, and let them soak until they were completely soft. Then I'd squeeze out the excess liquid and that wet bread pulp would go into my meatballs alongside the oats, making them even softer and stretching them even further. Or I would dry the stale pieces in the oven at low heat and turn them into breadcrumbs for coating things. Or I would layer thick slices of stale bread into the bottom of a casserole dish and pour leftover soup or braised vegetables over the top, and bake it until it became a dense, crusty, deeply savory thing my children called bread pie. They requested it. They asked for it by name. The seventh thing I learned is about perpetual soup. This is the old way, the way every grandmother in the world used to cook before modern convenience erased the knowledge. I kept a pot of soup on the back of my stove for the entire winter. Every single day I added to it. The water you boiled vegetables in, into the pot. The rind of Parmesan, into the pot. Celery tops, carrot peels that had been well scrubbed, the dark green tops of leeks, the tough outer leaves of cabbage, all of it into the pot. Bones from a roasted chicken or the shank bone from a pot roast, into the pot. The soup changed every day. It was never the same soup twice. Some days it was thin and light and clear. Other days, toward the end of the week, it had become dense and thick and almost stew-like. But it was always hot, always nourishing, always there. When a child came in from the cold with red cheeks and cold fingers, there was always something in that pot. That meant everything. The eighth trick is about potatoes, because potatoes kept us alive more times than I can count. We bought them in the largest bags we could find, because potatoes are one of the few foods in the world that are both filling and inexpensive, and can be prepared 100 different ways. But the trick I want to tell you is about the water. When you boil potatoes, the starchy water that remains in the pot is another ingredient, just like pasta water. I used potato water to thicken soups and stews in place of flour or cornstarch. I used it as part of the liquid when I made bread, because the starch helps the dough rise beautifully and gives the crust a wonderful chew. And potato water, salted and saved, can even be used to feed plants. Nothing was wasted. Nothing ever left my kitchen without being used until there was absolutely nothing left. The ninth secret is the poor man's pie. This was the meal that my children asked for more than any other. It was also the meal that I made when things were at their most desperate. It begins with whatever vegetables are cheapest and most plentiful. Cabbage, potatoes, carrots, onions. You sweat them in whatever fat you have saved, the chicken fat from the jar, a spoon of lard, a small piece of butter, until they are soft and golden and fragrant. Then you season them heavily, because seasoning costs almost nothing and transforms everything. Salt, pepper, dried thyme or marjoram, a bay leaf. You add a little of the perpetual soup broth, or water with a spoon of the drippings from the jar, and you let everything braise together until it becomes almost a thick mash of comfort. Then you put it into a baking dish and you cover it with a rough crust made from flour and fat and a pinch of salt and just enough cold water to bring it together. You bake it until the crust is golden and the kitchen smells like someone is having a celebration. My children thought we were celebrating, and maybe we were. By the 10th year of raising my family, I had become so fluent in this language of stretching and saving that it was no longer work. It was simply how I cooked. It was who I was. The tricks had stopped being tricks and had become instincts. When I saw a wilting bunch of celery, I didn't see something dying. I saw the beginning of a sofrito base for the next 3 dinners. When I saw a pot roast that had just come out of the oven, I didn't see a finished meal. I saw tonight's dinner, tomorrow's sandwiches, and the bones for the weekend's soup. Every ingredient had a past, a present, and a future in my kitchen. I think that is perhaps the most important thing Grandma Benedita gave me. Not the specific tricks, but the entire philosophy of nothing wasted, nothing without purpose, everything transformed. The 11th thing I want you to understand is about flavor and how a poor kitchen can produce flavors that a rich kitchen often cannot. Long, slow cooking develops complexity that money simply cannot buy. A cheap piece of meat braised for 4 hours in a covered pot with wine vinegar and aromatics will humble an expensive steak. Bread that has been allowed to rise slowly, overnight, has a depth of flavor that a quick risen loaf can never achieve. Soups that have been built over days have a richness that comes from time, not from expensive ingredients. Patience is the luxury ingredient. Time is the technique that costs nothing. I never had money, but I always had time, and I was never afraid to use it. And the 12th and final thing Grandma Benedita taught me, the thing I want to leave with you as I close this notebook and hold it against my chest for a moment, is this. A mother's love is the ingredient that cannot be measured and cannot be replicated by any recipe in any book. It is what makes a thin soup feel like a feast. It is what makes stale bread baked into a casserole feel like something precious and irreplaceable. My children are grown now. They have their own kitchens, their own families, their own grocery bills to worry about. But every single one of them still asks me to make the bread pie. Every one of them still remembers the sound of that great black cast iron pot clanging on the stove on a cold winter morning, the smell of something long cooked and deeply savory filling the whole house. They don't remember what we didn't have. They remember what I gave them. I hope that Benedita's notebook and these 12 things I've shared with you today give your family something to remember too, something warm and lasting and full.